We must not be afraid of dreaming the seemingly impossible if we want the seemingly impossible to become a reality. Václav Havel's words must guide us as we rethink what it means to be an active citizen in the 21st century and develop new institutional structures of governance capable of addressing both the foreseeable and unforeseeable risks we all face today. This is the seemingly impossible dream we must strive today to transform into reality in order to create tomorrow's sustainable, resilient global society. We have seen that each secular cycle represents a coherent system of governance, with its own conception of its moral purpose, organization principles, and notion of justice. The specific institutional structures of these systems of governance are composed of particular crystallizations of military, ideological, economic, and political networks of power. The territorially defined sovereign nation-state that emerged out of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 concentrated the power of all four networks in one geographical focal point, the capital city, and one dominant elite, centered first around a palace, then a parliament. This hierarchical, top-down, oligarchic model, where citizens usually have few democratic participation rights, is no longer capable of addressing the challenges we now face. This is why we can observe two simultaneous and seemingly opposite phenomena. We see the emergence of supranational institutions such as NATO, the EU, NAFTA, IMF, the WTO, that try to address issues that transcend state borders and can only be effectively addressed by groups of nations or even the entire world. We also observe the destabilization and even collapse of so-called failed states. These are structures of governance where the crystallization of the sovereign nation-state has been less effective than in Western Europe, where supranational institutions such as NATO and the EU are not available to reinforce their ability to function effectively, and that have reached much sooner the crisis stage in their evolutionary life cycle. Moving towards a decentered, organic, flexible, post-Westphalian system of governance requires us first to engage in a common reflection on how we can transcend the artificial inside-outside divide between the well-ordered, just, and democratic image of the nation-state and the supposedly unruly global community of states where the right of might trumps the might of right. Second, we must reintegrate in a new way our four networks of power in a coherent, effective, legitimate, and accountable cosmopolitan system of governance capable of addressing the problems we face today at local, regional, national, and global levels. If we consider the means side of the connexity matrix, we will note that here as well we must play four key roles. Guardians of the peace in our communities, our countries, our world, by developing new means of effective and legitimate enforcement through our protective military power networks. We must also actively participate as legislators in deliberative processes of decision-making in a multi-layered system of governance with multiple centers of political power. Our role as stakeholders of our associative networks of wealth creation is also critical if we are to ensure that competitive benchmarking of free market forces results in economic prosperity for all rather than conspicuous wealth for the very few. Finally, as adherents of various communities of belief or identity, we must respectfully recognize the rights of other similar groups to their own values, whilst sharing in a common effort to reconcile such diversity with our inherent human rights. The four fundamental values that emerge out of this analysis are therefore peace, participation, prosperity, and pluralism. All of them raise systemic challenges that can no longer be addressed by any one state, but only globally by all of them. They are systemic because they represent specific governance aspects of the connexity nexus that enable all our other daily interactions. The first challenge consists in challenging the current infomedia revolution on paths where our rights are protected, requiring our governments to be open and accountable, and allowing universal and affordable access to channels of information and communication. The second challenge is that of regulating global finance. The last global financial meltdown has demonstrated that banks and other financial institutions are not simply private organizations. They provide a critically important public service, the flow of money through our interconnected market economies. Such regulation to be effective can only happen globally, since otherwise financial instruments will easily shift from one location to another and motivate governments to engage in a race to the bottom to attract them. The third challenge is that of conflict management. Military interventions aiming to confront armed bandits such as ISIS in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram in Nigeria, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia must be both effective and legitimate in order to be supported by the affected local populations and to succeed. United Nations peacekeeping operations do possess a measure of international legitimacy, but they are rarely actually authorized and are even more rarely effective on the ground, as we have seen in the Rwanda and Bosnia genocides. The United States can intervene quickly and effectively if it so chooses, but lacks legitimacy as the world's self-appointed sheriff. It may win military battles, but just as often it loses the reconstruction and peacekeeping efforts that follow, and so it ends up overreaching itself and damaging its international standing, as has happened most recently in Afghanistan and Iraq. These cultural, economic, and military challenges lead us to the fourth political one, that of envisioning a coherent global system of governance that would include local, city, state, continental, and global administrative levels. It is only such a global decision-making level that would be able to set legitimate, effective, and enforceable rules of engagement for the first three issues, thus enabling all other levels of governance to apply them according to their specific needs and circumstances. The successful implementation of a solution to this critical political challenge is the prerequisite for the resolution of the three others. Such a new structure of global governance with multiple decision-making levels, structured in a connective, democratic, non-hierarchical manner, is called polycratic governance, from the Greek words poly, many, and kratos, power. It contains both territorial administrative levels, from neighborhoods and cities to regions, states, and the globe as a whole, and non-territorial levels, representing individuals' primary identities such as religion or nationality. States would no longer be sovereign and dominated by one national or religious group, whilst people sharing, for example, the same nationality could set common rules affecting their identity not only in their historical homeland, but wherever people sharing that ascribed identity may live throughout the world. This disassociation of territory and ascribed primary identity would go a long way towards eliminating the misguided and dangerous misuse of identitarian markers by unscrupulous leaders eager to reinforce their own power, position, and privileges. And thus remain true to Nelson Mandela's belief that to be free is not merely to cast off one's chain, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. A legitimate global level of governance where politicians would be elected by cosmopolitan citizens choosing to actively participate in decision-making processes affecting us all would focus primarily on managing the systemic problems already outlined, thus enabling the other levels of the polycratic system to function in an effective and accountable manner. It would have both the necessary legitimacy and resources required to set up a global rapid intervention force, capable of dealing with both man-made and humanitarian global disasters, not necessarily militarily, but militarily if necessary. It would be able to create a global financial oversight authority to ensure that the events leading to the global financial meltdown of 2008 will not be repeated, and that the global race to the bottom will not develop between countries desiring to attract financial investments and institutions. Finally, it would be able to enact an infomedia freedom, accessibility, and transparency charter, setting globally enforceable rules regarding the flows of data and information that increasingly condition our lives today. Another area where a global level of governance could set universal standards is that of environmental protection. However, the reach of the global administrative level must be limited to only those issues that demand truly global solutions, and therefore cannot be resolved more effectively by other levels of governance closer to the citizens they represent. How do we engage in a transition from the current system of global governance, composed of institutions such as the UN, the WTO, the EU, and NATO, whose ultimate aim is invariably to rescue and stabilize the current disintegrating international system of sovereign nation states, to a new structure of global governance, in Latin, novus edificium terrae orbis. In other words, how do we move on from a NATO 1.0 dedicated to the preservation of sovereign states in a largely anarchic international society to a NATO 2.0 based on the 8 key values emerging from our ends and from our means required to achieve them: innovation, inclusion, preservation, diversity, and peace, participation, prosperity, pluralism. This is what we shall examine in the last 3 episodes of the Lafayette Gambit.